Boa tarde, bem-vindos. Quem precisar de auscultadores para tradução simultânea estão à disposição no secretariado. Stella, can you understand Portuguese? No, you shouldn't. Is there somebody from the organization here? Besides me? Stella, I will speak in Portuguese for a while. Muito obrigado a todos por virem. Muito obrigado, Raquel. Bakary, Stella, Teresa, thanks. Now we are going to begin the panel 2 about the hierarchy of wars. When I was young, I saw a movie of cowboys that was named The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. That's how we put the hierarchy of wars, the good, the bad, and not the ugly, but the fashionable. Why there are wars that are so visible and there are other wars that disappear from the radar? And is this some kind of hierarchization? And whatever other things the panel want to discuss, they will discuss, because I know Raquel, she will follow her own agenda. I should like to present, it's an irony, okay? I'm presenting Bakary Samb. Do we have now, Bakary, you don't have, you have? Yes. Stella, now you have? I'm skipping to Portuguese. Vou apresentar-vos, portanto, neste painel, nós teremos Bakary Samb. Bakary Samb é diretor regional do Instituto Timbuktu, com sede em Dakar, no Senegal. E ele é um especialista em conflitos violentos de natureza identitária, religiosa, ou pelo menos é isso que ele tem estudado ultimamente e provavelmente se irá referir a esse assunto. Muito obrigado por ter vindo, Bakary. Raquel Vaz Pinto é investigadora do Instituto Português de Relações Internacionais da Universidade Nova de Lisboa. Raquel é membro do Clube de Lisboa, uma grande amiga, e sempre disponível para fazer este tipo de atividades. Muito obrigado, Raquel. Stella Gervas é professora de História na Universidade de Newcastle, no Reino Unido, e estuda a História Europeia desde o Iluminismo até ao presente, com foco na Rússia. Eu conheci a Stella há 2 meses atrás na livraria Bertrand, onde ela apresentou a versão em português de um livro dela que em português se chama A Conquista da Paz. Passe a publicidade. Teresa Cravo é professora de Relações Internacionais da Universidade de Coimbra, é investigadora do Centro de Estudos Sociais da Universidade de Coimbra, que é um centro muito conhecido entre nós que estamos nesta área, mas como é de Coimbra, enfim, não é de Lisboa, o que é que se há de fazer? A Teresa é uma boa amiga também, agradeço muito que ela esteja presente. Raquel Vaz Pinto, eu pedi-lhe que, para além de ser oradora, fosse também a condutora deste painel. Portanto, eu vou-lhe passar a palavra e ela vai fazer a condução do painel e apresentar as opiniões dela, da forma como ela achar melhor. E a única coisa que eu peço à Raquel é que deixe 30 minutos no fim para que a audiência coloque as suas próprias questões. Muito obrigado a todos.
Good afternoon again. In this afternoon, we have a very broad agenda, a very important theme, and a very distinguished panel. Before I give the floor to Bakary, I would just like to highlight the book that Stella published just recently. And you can see here the translation into Portuguese, A Conquista da Paz, do Iluminismo à União Europeia, e aqui fica a recomendação de livro que certamente vos vai fazer pensar. Now, going into this, what I would like to start with the question of the panel, which is, in your own opinion, do you think there is a hierarchy of wars? And why do you think there is or it is not? So, 5, maximum 10 minutes. First broad introductory remarks. We start with following the order of the panel. So, first Bakary, then Stella, and then Teresa. Bakary, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I will try to make it in English, in spite of my very basic English. But first of all, I would like to thank the Lisbon Club and the sympathetic friend Fernando. I know during our first collaboration with IMVF, based here in Lisbon. Greetings to Carolina and Ahmed. And I thank your club for organizing this meeting and for inviting African voices to a discussion on the New World Order. During the 19, when being a student in Europe, I was highly critical of the Lisbon process, which was aiming to construct a Euro-Mediterranean strategic space. We forgot that the Sahel means, above all in Arabic, the river, the other side of the Great Desert. The Sahara has never been an impassable barrier, but an inland sea which invites to go to shore from another one. Until the former president of France, Nicolas Sarkozy, attempts to set up a union for the Mediterranean, the dominant geopolitical thinking focused on the link with the northern shore of the Mediterranean, forgetting or neglecting the sub-Saharan Africa. The first mistake, according to me, from our European partners was made when terrorist group appeared in Northern Africa society. It was to be expected that they would spread south of the Sahara in view of the historical and cultural geopolitical continuum. The outbreak of the Libyan conflict now was a wake-up call, but one that showed that the problem of this region should be, in my view, analyzed with a view of a larger picture. So I think that between us and Europe, speaking from Africa, it will be important for us to see how to make up for 40 years of delay. Europeans are intervening in Africa, but they forget that they have more than 40 years of delay. After this question, the other question was, what did we miss together? And what can we do and what can we co-construct? How to make up for 40 years of delay? You can remember the effect of drought in the 70s, the instability of international partners to assist their inability to assist international partners to assist drought affected Sahelian countries, and the partners themselves at the same time in Europe was hit by the financial and oil crisis. And in this period, we have the rise of oil-producing countries. And I think that those countries in the Middle East, they have the first Sahel strategy. This first Sahel strategy have two pillars at this moment, what they call da'wah and what they call ighatha. Da'wah means preaching and ighatha with humanitarian work. And there is more and more a kind of substitution for the state to provide basic social services and a large-scale preaching companies. In the meantime, the international community have a first misjudgment. The international community did not understand the stake of such a rupture, imposing structural adjustment on Sahelian and other African countries, weakening state that can no longer provide basic social service. And the result number one for this strategy was that the Sahel strategy of oil-producing countries with Islamist extremist ideology, there was a strong position in the educational and social field to the point of competing strongly with the state. And our friend from Europe come later. And now the status is so favorable to the state competitor like Islamist movement. Religious actors are identified as privileged interlocutor. They have a monopoly of the religious discourse that is meaningful for the population. They take advantage of the weakness of the state, which face the challenge of the state deficit. So what did we miss together, Africa and Europe? I think that it is time to give the dignity of solutions to indigenous possibility and strategies. And the Sahelian stalemate that is emerging from the all-military option is coupled with a dilemma. This new Sahelian dilemma for the European lies in the difficult position of the state, of the region, and their international partners. In the solution proposed to fight terrorism, we have almost lost our sense of priorities. I come from a region where building a new school is cheaper than buying a second-hand tank. So exactly what we need is not just military intervention, but we need development. And in the many ways, Africa seems to have been left behind. While at the same time, the ISIS nebula in the Middle East and Europe is in retreat, our continent has become the new hotspot for the redeployment of international terrorism. There is a rather telling paradox noted by a former Burkinabe minister who was saying, after countless conferences, the international community has been looking in vain for 423 million euro for the G5 Sahel to combat the terrorism in the Sahel. For years, they say we cannot find 423 million euro to help and to support the G5 Sahel. In the meantime, whereas 60 billion euro were mobilized for Ukraine in a single conference and in one afternoon. In fact, there is no lack of military initiative, but a global approach to the multifaceted phenomenon of terrorism. And I think that after this situation, who was able, for example, to imagine that Burkina Faso could become a target now? We have the current situation. That's why we have to mobilize ourselves to prevention in countries like Guinea-Bissau, and we see also the surprise in Mozambique also. And now, to finish, what can we co-construct to do together? The solution in the Sahel will necessarily be co-constructed or will not be found soon. In view of the failure of solitary military initiative like Barkhane, like the French intervention, I think that now we have to to work together. The Sahel just need everyone, but together. And the work on addressing the root causes of terrorism beyond military intervention with development project. Europe, which must better highlight its weight and capacity to build synergies that will be more legitimate than solitary military intervention like the French one. But I think that the situation now has changed. Why I'm optimistic regarding Africa? Because in Europe, when I listened this morning what was said about Africa, I realized that people do not understand the current change in our continent. Today, the situation has changed, and Africa should do better in this new great game. For at least three reasons. There is 3 reasons for that. First, we are in a divided world in which alignment are both multiple and diffuse. Secondly, we are in a world when the distribution of power is very fragmented, with the combined effect of classical power that are declining, emerging powers that are rising, and a multitude of states that are claiming middle power states. And finally, and this is the most important, we are in a context of an Africa which, through the dual effect of an increasingly elite, are more demanding population, is trying to get a better grip on the game of international relations. And in this context, to conclude, which for once can be very beneficial to us in Africa. Africa is moving, at least in the perceptions, from an accurate area, a simple adjustment variable, to a more comfortable and advantaged area in which its influence and weight could decide the balance of power on an international scale. And we see that with the energy crisis, the oil crisis, the gas crisis. Every day we have the visit of the German Chancellor, President of Spain, everything. And I think that Africa must stop to be constantly seen as a mere opportunity, a market to be conquered, or resources to be exploited. It is time to change mentalities and to consider this continent as a strategic partner. This is what Portuguese actors such as the Marquis de Falfror Institute are doing in the context of establishment of the Peace Observatory in Guinea-Bissau, for example, and the launching of a global reflection on a holistic and inclusive approach to the challenge ahead regarding the situation very worrying in Mozambique. I had the valuable opportunity, it's my last sentence. I had this valuable opportunity to talk to a former German Chancellor 3 years ago. I will perhaps betray the secrecy of the meeting to tell you the same thing I told to her at the end of our conversation in Senegal. After a decade, when the term international community meant at most 5 powerful countries with veto power, we have finally become a real international community. We are now the international community with the same vulnerability. If Europe continues to believe that what happens in the Sahel, in West Africa, in Southern Africa, does not concern it directly, it will be a fatal mistake, because sooner or later, you, our European partners, you will receive your share of what happens in the Sahel, in Guinea-Bissau, in Mozambique, and elsewhere, either through wave of migration that you will never be able to stop, or through the borderless terrorism that make us as vulnerable in Timbuktu, Gao, Ouagadougou, as we are in Brussels, Washington, or Paris. So we have a common destiny. We have to act together with solidarity, with humanism. Otherwise, will perish, but together. Thank you.
So now, Stella, the floor is yours. 10 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Raquel. First of all, let's say how grateful I am for to the organizers for their excellent efficiency and very, very warm welcome here in Lisbon. So I'm very happy to be back in Lisbon. I never come before this year. I came first time in the spring at the occasion of the translation of my book on peace in Portuguese, and that it's my third time in 1 year. And I would like to express to everyone all my thanks to your really warm hospitality. That it's really appreciable. When I saw the title of this panel, the hierarchy of wars, the good, the bad, and the fashionable, I thought immediately, of course, of Sergio Leone's spaghetti Western. Fernando mentioned it. I haven't seen this movie for years. I haven't watched, so it was an opportunity to go to it, and which is called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and which is about the American Civil War. By the way, I recommend to everyone to watch this old spaghetti Western. I am a historian of peace in Europe. And as the organizer challenged us with such a title, I would like also to respond in the same spirit in 3 brief points. So my first point, let's agree about what do we mean by war and versus what do we mean by peace. We talk a lot this morning, and especially about wars, and they are about their nature, and precisely because the topic of this panel is on the hierarchy of wars, I would like to say that in my view there's a lot of semantic jumble today when we talk about war and peace. Wars or military operations are sometimes defined with the terms of peace, and situation of state of peace are described in terms of wars. So restoration of peace is often conceived as a police operation or as a military occupation. President Vladimir Putin said that he was bringing peace to Ukraine when he was bombing the civilians. And it reminds me the situation of the European colonial conquests in Africa in the 19th century, which was called pacification. So a primitive way of defining peace would be to say it's an absence of war. But is this sufficient? I would say it's a good start. It's a basic definition. But let's give me a counterexample. Building a wall separating 2 states or 2 communities, like the United Nations buffer zone in Cyprus, is this peace? Today we have 2 blocks in Europe. On one side, of course, is Russia. On the other side, it's NATO. How should we call this state? A state of peace, a state of war? Is it a phony war? Is it a cold war? And of course, we have an open war in Ukraine. But can we call the state we have today in Europe a state of peace? Peace is something different. It's not just the absence of war. It is a trust, it's a trade, free circulation of peoples, of goods and ideas. Peace is reconciliation, like the reconciliation we had between the French and the Germans. Peace, it's solidarity. My second point is that there is no good war, period. It's true that from a legal viewpoint, Russian invasion of Ukraine could be called as a crime of aggression, or another term which is also used, a crime against peace. Ukraine is in the position to have the right to defend herself, itself. It was attacked, it was aggressed. So in legal terms, you should rather call it a just war. But asking this question about wars in value or ethical terms, good or bad, that it's a different question. So I will be blunt. There is never a good war. Anywhere, anytime. All my research on the history of peace in Europe bring me to what I call an organic metaphor, which comes from the French encyclopedia of Diderot of the 18th century. And there it's an entry, an article on peace, which is in fact more about war. It says, war is a disease. Is a disease, a convulsive disease of the body politic, in modern terms, of the international community. So this organic metaphor considers that the international community, it's a whole, it's one body, and each state, it's a cellule, it's a cell, it's a small part of this big whole community. And here, precisely, that allows me to say that the international community today, it's not in a state of health. The state of peace when we have harmonious relationship among the states, based, as I said, on trust and circulation, exchange, etc. And that's my main point here, that we can, of course, in situation of self-defense, we call it a just war, but this ethical terminology of good and bad applied to wars, it's not, it's a completely different question, so I wouldn't apply it in this case. And my third and final point is the hierarchy of wars. The hierarchy of wars, if I should rephrase this question, that would be the victims of one conflict, let's say in the Middle East or in Africa, less valuable or less important than the victims of another conflict? We feel here immediately, we see that it makes us uncomfortable, because that will be us saying that we have a hierarchy of human beings. That applies also to the refugees. Are some refugees better than others? On which basis? And as Declaration of Human Rights tell us, especially the Article 1, all human beings are born free and equal in their dignity and rights. So that is definitely, I see in this question or in the topic of this, it's a challenge, of course, and it's definitely was conceived as a provocation, but I see definitely a problem related to what I call a prejudice, basically. So the time of colonies is over, but these prejudices are still there. So we can also call it a parochialism, you know, it's a prejudice, or in extreme case, even racism. But there is a second factor at play. Why there seems to be much more interest of governments, of European governments, or even of the European Union in Brussels to some wars and not to others. And in the case of Ukraine, you already mentioned, Bakary, that of course this interest, it's a major interest on the side of the European Union. We can think about various factors of this interest. And one of them, of course, is the geopolitical one. Ukraine as a key region for oil and gas, so what we call the geopolitics of the pipelines. Ukraine is situated on the immediate borders of the European Union. And in a selfish way, we could say that Ukraine is the defense shield of Europe. And that it's explain in some ways that governments usually tend to prioritize certain conflicts and certain wars, and that comes from an interest. You know, that it's usually what in Brussels we will use this term by saying political, geopolitical, economic interests. So, and basically that the governments, you know, they all meet their priority agendas or prioritize certain wars because they all meet their agenda. And finally, about the visibility, so that will be my conclusion. Why some wars are more visible than in others. That was also the part of this conversation and of this panel we have. It's a kind of a toxic mix, if you wish. On one hand, we have these cultural stereotypes about that certain populations, certain nations will be better than others. And on the other hand, we have these interests, various kind of interests at the government level, at the governmental level. But my conclusion will be here that as all human beings are born equal, all wars are equal bad. Yeah, thank you.
Teresa?
Thank you very much, Raquel. I would like to start by thanking the Lisbon Club for the very kind invitation in the persons of its president, Ambassador Francisco Seixas da Costa, and its executive director, but also sort of the mentor of these conferences, Professor Fernando Jorge Cardoso. It was, as we all know, easier to come to Lisbon than from Lisbon going to Coimbra, even though it's the exact same number of kilometers. But it's with a lot of pleasure that I do come here often and way more often than the other way around. This is just to answer the provocation about me coming from the rural areas of the country. So I wanted to talk about, to divide my very brief presentation in two parts. The first of all, to talk about some axes of analysis that allows us to think of why some wars matter more than others, and then some very brief conclusions about what I think it means to have this sort of hierarchies, given that I take for granted that the answer to the question whether there are hierarchies to wars is most definitely yes. So in terms of axes of analysis, just 2 points. The axes are not at all surprising. This is just my very humble attempt at systematizing how we can think about them. And second is that they're pretty much intricately linked. So I want to talk about geography, time/duration, scale and type, actors involved, international context, implications, and media attention. So that's a lot of axes. But okay, so in terms of geography, sorry?
In 10 minutes.
In 10 minutes, because I'll literally say one sentence about each of them. So in terms of geography, one clear sort of fact in terms of how we think about wars and why some matter more than others has to do with center versus periphery, right? So where exactly the war is occurring matters, is extremely important. It's not the only factor that matters. I mean, we do have sort of wars in Europe that are more dormant and less less visible, and they are in the center, but they're still in the periphery of the center. So the axis of analysis of center-periphery still works even in those circumstances. But obviously, wars in the center of the system will always be wars that will garner attention much more than the opposite. It also matters in terms of geography whether the war has a tendency or the potential to spread. So for instance, World War I obviously was in the center, but it moved to the periphery, but the periphery was a very specific periphery. It was pretty much the extensions of the colonial possession, of the colonial territories of the powers in the center of the system. So that turned it into a world war, and obviously that dimension was incredibly important to make it one of the major wars of the 20th century. So where it takes place, whether it can spread, what sort of region we're talking about is extremely important. In terms of time/duration, I think we need to acknowledge that we all have a rather small span of attention. And so wars that tend to linger, that tend to get out of the radar in terms of our, the international community's attentions, all we need to do is to look very close by to Syria, which going into its 11th year of war is obviously much less talked about than it was right at the beginning. It is still a very devastating war. It still has a huge amount of casualties, but because it has lingered for so long, we've sort of stopped thinking about it. And so it's important the time in which it occurs, but also how long it takes to sort of make us devote attention to it or cease doing so. Just as an anecdote, the Center for Social Studies has a very interesting program of extension in which we go to high schools to do some sessions. And when the war started, or shortly afterwards, I offered to do sessions on the Syrian conflict. And right at the beginning, I had a huge amount of invitations from high schools because all the students wanted to hear about the Syrian war. And I've stubbornly kept the theme sort of open and on offer. And now I have like 3 requests. Obviously, it might be my own skills, I'll grant you that, but it is a lot to do. It has a lot to do with the attention that the Syrian conflict has or has ceased to have at the moment. So our time span is quite important here. Then obviously the scale and type. So it's interesting how, in terms of type, the Ukraine war, because it has gone back to the conventional type of war between states with conventional battlefields, it actually garners much more attention because there are a lot of dimensions to talk about when we're talking about a conventional war. It's different from the sort of jihadi insurgency type of war or type of attacks. This one, you can actually film it in permanence, and so the type of war is quite important, and obviously the scale. So the scale, not just the intensity of it, but also the type of arms that are being used. So one of the reasons why we're all, and rightly so, very worried about the war in Ukraine, it's because it can actually sort of slide down into a nuclear catastrophe. And so it's good that we're paying attention to it, and obviously the type of arms are important. But also other sorts of wars that made it into the radar because they were using anti-personnel mines, for instance, which were at a certain point considered immoral type of weapons, and then they were actually illegalized from an international law point of view. But we started paying attention to that sort of wars because we thought the weapons that were being used in those wars were an ethical problem for the international community. So the type of armament, the type of war, the scale and the intensity of the war is also quite important. Then naturally, the fourth element, the actors involved. So one thing we can know for sure is that if it involves great powers, it will be a war that matters for the international community. And so if it involves, namely, the great powers of the system, with the chance of them getting involved directly in terms of armed hostilities, that is a big problem. So when we were, during the Cold War, we were incredibly concerned with the possibility of the two great powers, the Soviet Union and the United States, to be dragged onto a war into direct confrontation. So the system was pretty much amenable to the wars in the periphery, even though there were huge levels of violence in the system during the Cold War. But the main concern was to make sure that neither of those wars in the periphery would drag the two superpowers into direct confrontation and hence lead to a global war. So we're interested in the actors, we're interested in how the actors are involved, and also we're interested in whether the actors can prevent a war from coming into the radar. So obviously we have the notion of allies and enemies that works in terms of the actors involved and how a particular war might make it into the radar or not. So one example will be Western Sahara, which is one of the forgotten wars of the international system, has lasted since the 70s with some brief ceasefires. But because there is a very clear alliance between Morocco, the occupying power, and the great powers of the system, namely the European Union, the US, and now a bunch of African states as well, unfortunately, it means that this war has all the requisites to just remain under the radar. So it's the actors involved, and namely how they are involved, not just who they are. In terms of the context, another issue that can make a war become quite important has to do with the international context in terms of whether these wars have the potential to change the system, to cause a profound alteration to the status quo. So in this case, as I was saying, in the Cold War, the wars in the periphery were accepted because they weren't actually, as long as it was clear that they wouldn't drag the superpowers, they could keep the system stable. So it was okay to have that sort of wars. When I mean okay, I mean it was ethically terribly wrong, but they were pretty much accepted as, it's fine as long as they don't cause a major change in the system and the system remains stable, that's fine. I think one of the issues with the Ukraine war is actually the opposite, is because we are in a context of transition in terms of world order. And so these wars, namely fought by revisionist powers, and let me say here that it's not just Russia that is a revisionist power at the moment, the US is a revisionist power at the moment, and China is a revisionist power at the moment. And so this sort of wars it's very unlikely that they will just stay localized, and they have the tendency, or at least the potential, to change the system. And so the context here matters, and that's why obviously we should be looking at Ukraine very, very carefully. The sixth point is the implications, and so the impact of them. So this is the difference between a localized war. Localized war doesn't mean it's just being fought by local actors, because all wars are internationalized. There are no wars these days that are hermetically sealed. But there are wars that have a much more globalized sort of impact. The Ukraine war, again, is a good example of that, because of the disruption to, the potential to cause famine, and obviously the problems in terms of energy, etc. So the type of, if we're talking about wars that have the potential to disrupt world trade, to cause major flows of migrations into the center, because if they remain in the periphery, they're sort of accommodated, but if they challenge the center, then that becomes a problem. And also if they disrupt the world economy, all of that matters in terms of whether a war becomes important or not. The last point, just to finish, is media attention, which is obviously related to all of the above, but actually the media does have the potential to change some of these factors. So the media can actually keep our attention going for longer than expected, or it can sort of recover our attention towards particular wars if it makes them become visible again. It also obviously can make a faraway war feel much, much closer. And so it has an impact in terms of how we think about geography, how our mental maps work. And obviously it's very important because media conglomerates tend to pay attention to the global north, and so the center more than others, and so there's that as well. Just to finish off, and pretty much agreeing with what Bakary and Stella said before me, these factors sort of combine in various ways, the factors that I was mentioning, and sometimes in very unexpected ways. I think an example closer to home is what happened in East Timor, which was at war for a number of decades against the Indonesian occupier, and it needed a sort of a perfect storm for the international community to finally pay attention to it and then ultimately lead to its independence. So there's some surprising factors. The system isn't static. But overall, wars are hierarchical because wars are a product of the international system, which is hierarchical in itself. And so this will always happen as long as the international order is a hierarchical one, even if the players change in terms of who will matter more or less in international order. And just to finish, obviously, it's incredibly important to understand that this is a problem, and that in a way, all wars should be, as Stella was saying, wars of the international community. And so we should make an effort to move away from all these premises that make us care more about, Ukrainians and less about Somalis or Yemenis or even people in Afghanistan, because they tend to sort of be replaced in terms of our span of attention. Thank you. Sorry.
Now, we've had a lot of food for thought from our three speakers, and I would just like to remind them that I'm playing the devil's advocate, okay? So, for Bakary, as I was listening to your points and the issues pertaining Sahel and many of the obstacles, challenges, I was wondering, I was thinking, or I would like to hear you a bit more on one of the players, one of the actors, which is of course crucial in terms of the African continent. And by the way, I think one of the a really interesting book that I read throughout the summer was a book by a Nigerian with a brilliant title, which says, "Africa is not a country," in the sense of the heterogeneity of a continent that we tend to speak of as if it was homogeneous. And that is, of course, a big mistake, but it's also, it drives us away from what would be a good photograph and therefore a good perception of reality. So my question to you would be, how do you view the role of the African Union within the context of these specific types of conflict, the war that you're describing, which affects everybody and not just within the borders of a continent, but also outside. So that would be my question to you. To Stella, of course, as I was listening, I was thinking of course, there is the interest of great powers, middle powers, but doesn't it, to a certain extent, amount to proximity? In the sense of, isn't it to be expected that Europeans in general, I'm not even going into the heterogeneity of Europe, would be more interested in a war in the Ukraine for cultural, historical, and of course, geopolitical reasons. So that would be, why not just proximity? And the second question would be, because it's not possible to solve everything, shouldn't we try to solve what's more important or, in a sense, more close to what would be your goals in terms of foreign and domestic policy? So that would be my provocation. For Teresa, I would very much like to listen to the, you brought so many issues to the table. I think that I couldn't agree more. We are within the international, we are witnessing a transition period. We do not know yet how this is going to, what's going to happen around the corner. But I really wanted to hear a bit more about the issue of revisionist powers and the wars that revisionist powers provoke or tend to accelerate. And here, very interestingly, on how is the US a revisionist power? And of course, China and Russia as well. So that would be my take. And secondly, you touched a very important point, the issue of center and periphery. And sometimes center and periphery is also part of your mental map. Weren't the wars in the former territory of Yugoslavia peripheral to a certain extent within Europe? And in that regard, the center and the periphery, doesn't all that we have been discussing, talking, and thinking, shouldn't we not use the expression international community? In the sense of, isn't it something that we strive towards, but it's not actually helpful in describing the world today? So that would be my second provocation to you. Bakary? So we share a microphone.
Okay, thank you. Yes. Okay. When I was talking about Africa and the need to change the mentalities, that is, in Europe, people continue to see the continent as a problem. And this new generation of Portuguese, who is the university, my advice is to have a new vision of this continent, which is creative, with very young, brilliant people who are trying to solve problems, who have indigenous strategies, and they have. I don't want that this new generation inherited a bad vision of Africa. You have not to consider Africa that as a problem, but as a new opportunity of a new world. Talking about now the role of African Union. Okay, if I say it is about the Russian and Ukrainian conflict, no, it's about okay, about
in general.
Okay, yeah, in general, okay.
That we tend to forget and we should not.
Yes, African Union is trying to do its best, and but you know the main problem sometimes is to coordinate. But also there is another kind of problem from our European and foreign partners. They come in Africa with their own strategy. For example, for the Sahelian crisis, you have more than 21 Sahel strategies. Most of them was conceived out of the Sahel in Europe and without the Sahelians. And you have our countries which trying to deal with each partners, but I think that the effect of these strategies the European or the American want to impose in Africa that make our efforts sometimes unuseful, or we are not able to coordinate because there is some problem. The other problem I have raised it now, it's kind of choice, the hierarchy of the choices. When the Sahelian countries in G5 Sahel, during 9 years, were expecting to have 423 millions of euros to solve the problem, the international community say, no, we have no money. But in one afternoon, for Ukraine, they have more than 6 billion or more. So it is clear that now in Africa, we are aware that we have to take our destiny in our hands. And we have the means to do that because the world is changing. Europe needs Africa. And now, and say Africa is not just a problem, now it is a solution. If we see during the oil crisis, the energy crisis with the conflict in Russia, I have never heard about visit of European head of state in West Africa, in Ivory Coast, in Senegal, because of they need gas. And now the relationship between Spain and Morocco has changed. The relationship between Italy and Algeria. I see that we have a new opportunity to reconstruct a better partnership. And I think European Union, African Union needs the solidarity, international need the support of European Union and the Europeans. But we need more. What we need is how to give the dignity of solution to our indigenous strategies. How to change from a world where they think about us, on us, and from their own perspective, and impose their view, while we have indigenous solution, we have possibility to discuss and to be united like the European Union. And I think by doing that, we can have finally a very good opportunity in this context where Europe needs Africa and Africa needs Europe to construct a better partnership. Thank you.
Stella, please. So thank you very much, Raquel, for your challenging and very pertinent questions. I fully agree with your remark and comment about the proximity. Indeed, in terms and geopolitical terms, geographical terms, so Ukraine is just on the borders of the European Union, so and that it's threatening the security and peace in Europe, and that's fully so I fully agree. But I think here that it's a question of perspective from where we are looking at it. And I am thinking about the Ukrainian side, because Ukrainians have for years they continue to say that they were in a war with Russia. I remember once when I used the terms of the Russian invasion of Crimea. So when writing a piece for the United Nations magazine, I was asked to remove the word, to delete the word invasion. Aggression didn't work, so they suggested annexation with quote marks. And that was like 10 years ago. So just to say that even the vocabulary, the words we are using, we are putting on various conflicts, tells us tells us also about the way how we are perceiving different conflicts, different wars, and this hierarchy. Basically, hierarchy of war. So some conflicts, you should use the term conflict, not name it a war. So, and in Ukrainian side, they continuously have been saying for more than 10 years, it's a war. So we are in a state of war with Russia. So, you know, we needed certainly that Russia just aggress the borders and invade Ukraine, militarily invade Ukraine with the force of arms, that we started to realize that was indeed, we didn't have a state of peace on the borders of Europe. There was a frozen conflict. And in fact, what we call this frozen conflict, or in terms of the philosophers of the 18th century, they said that there was an armed truce. We have many armed truces in Europe, but that it's not a state of peace, it's a state of war. Basically, all these conflicts in Ossetia, in Transnistria and Moldova, on the eastern borders of Europe, also in Georgia, Armenia and Azerbaijan, they are all of them armed truce. So basically, in modern terms, will be a frozen conflict, any moment that can explode. So it's a way to say that you haven't, after the end of the Cold War, we weren't in a state of peace. Like we like to say that in Europe we are a state of peace. We had a very limited, relative state of peace in the western part of the continent. But we live this relative peace in the western part of the continent is a part of this system of war, because and this Cold War, it's a question that we can ask if this Cold War have ever been finished, because 30 years ago, so we said finally we joined the Europeans, the Eastern Europeans, the Central European countries joined the European project, the project for peace, the European Union, and finally we live together in peace and prosperity and democracy. But all other frozen conflicts around, that was not a state of peace. So, and that it's definitely one of the questions we should think about. When studying the history of war and peace in Europe, I should say from the start that it's not like black and white, war and peace. They are both part of the same world. So it's a different degrees. We can't talk about different degrees of wars, but it's everything. It's very complex. So, I was wondering, because we are discussing so much about wars, we have a critical situation. It's a crisis in Europe. Many think that this war in Ukraine, it's a shift. So we are witnessing the end of an era, of an old age, and the start of a new age. And that all other democracies and these ideals of civilization are threatened now by a great power, by Russia. My second point here, we are, of course, talking about wars, but the hierarchy of wars, but sometimes it reminds me the famous theological debate in the Middle Ages when we were talking about the sex of the angels, which was, let's talk about the sex of the wars, basically, when we should think in terms of cure. Which treatment to the international community, which cure we can propose, which kind of peace plans you can think about the war in Ukraine and many other wars and conflicts mentioned. And that is for me even an invitation I wanted to address to the Club of Lisbon, because that was to think in times of war about peace. And having a peace plan, it's a necessity for survival. And because precisely the people, the political leaders or the monarchs or the princes of the previous centuries who won the wars, they thought about the next step, which is a peace plan. And today, of course, we are thinking that it's too early to think about any peace plans. If you look on social media and, of course, in media, that it's a different projects or plans coming from different people. But what I learned from studying the long term of history of peace and peacemaking in Europe is that precisely during the wars, the next plans for peace was made. So that it's also an invitation for me to reflect further on that.
Thank you so much. That was a really good answer.
Thank you, Raquel, for your questions. Regarding the why is the US a revisionist power? So I disagree with the general assumption that rising powers are necessarily revisionist and great powers are necessarily committed to the status quo. First of all, because rising states might actually wish not to challenge the system that allowed them to rise. And at the other end, because a great power can actually contest international rules and institutions that it helped create and that is sustaining, right? And so I think if we look at the US, we can see that happening. And we see that happening in various moments because of what I was saying, that obviously an international system isn't static, and so the behavior of powers isn't static either. So you have, I think the way to look at it is not so much whether the state is rising, declining, or, you know, currently established, but more whether it is satisfied or dissatisfied with the current status quo. And I think in the case of the US, it is clear that it has at various moments contested the same rules and institutions that it helped create. I think if we obviously, in terms of examples, if we go to the Bush administration, its war in Iraq was a highly revisionist sort of war. It had the intention to revise the status quo in the Middle East, obviously in a way that would be beneficial, but that goes for everyone. So that's not the difference, right? But so it was quite revisionist from that perspective. The Trump administration, I mean, examples, the agreements between Israel and the various Middle Eastern states. That is a clear revisionist idea for the Middle East as a geographical space. Leaving arms treaties. On the part of the US, it wasn't just Russia that left. Leaving UNESCO. And basically, part of an organization that only survived because of huge amounts of funding from the US. You leave, what does that mean exactly? You're definitely revising how that institution works. So I think looking at rising states as the only possible instigators of wars cause a huge blind spot in terms of violence in the system. And so, and generally speaking, I do peace studies, so I have a lot of blame to apportion to most actors of the system. So I feel like when we're talking about the international system and the only thing we're talking about is replacing the US with China or something like that, and so we change the players, but the rules of the game remain exactly the same, I see absolutely no benefit from it. I see benefits in a multipolar order for the periphery, because it has more space of maneuver than when it's pretty much submissive to one single great power. But it's also, without any doubt, a much more sort of dangerous, riskier sort of international system. So we do have to pay attention to that. But yes, I'm sorry, the US is a revisionist power, and it has instigated plenty of wars as well. That doesn't mean the other players are not to blame, but, yeah.
It's fine, Teresa. We got the point. Don't worry.
And yes, by the way, I do believe that Russia invaded Ukraine and that is a war of aggression and all of that, just to clarify. But in terms of your second question about center-periphery being mental maps, yeah, but entirely in agreement. I think one of the most interesting ways of looking at it is how when the war in Ukraine started, you heard so many people saying, the first war in Europe after the Second World War. And I was thinking, how is that? No, that is not an okay thing to say. That's definitely not true. Obviously, this is a major war, but it was not the first war in Europe since the Second World War. There have been plenty, and namely, there's been one that has been pretty, you know, from a moral perspective, pretty catastrophic. The Balkans War should sort of, you know, weigh on our conscience to the point that we don't say that Ukraine is the first war in Europe after Second World War. So that's definitely a way of relegating the Balkans to a periphery, and with all of that goes our lack of attention and everything else. So yeah, thanks.
Yes, so just to my provocations, I really thank you all for answering them. I was thinking that when we are discussing, when I talk to my students and we are discussing this issue of mental maps, and it's not a good or a bad thing, it is what it is in the sense of it reflects our imagination, our history, our education, our priorities, whatever. And it can be, depending on the mental map, but what I'm trying to say is that we all have them. I'm not saying it's either good or bad in that sense. So when I try to give an example to my students, I usually use this one, which is, why do we tend to look at the Mediterranean as something, particularly in Portugal, something like Mare Nostrum, Roman times, and so forth. And we tend to see, for instance, Athens, and of course, for good reasons, do not get me wrong, but we forget to include in this mental map cities that are closer to us in geography on the other side of the Mediterranean. So that is, I think, an example of a mental map in the sense of why it is close or why is it far away. And as I was listening to all of you as well, I was also thinking about the issue of war, the issue of peace, but also the issue of what comes with it in terms of human rights or human security. And as you were talking, Teresa, I actually thought you were going to go for the International Criminal Court, because that's also a very good example of why most of the great powers have not ratified the International Criminal Court. And that, of course, also includes the US, but it also has China, it also has Russia, and so forth. So I think that's also an... pretty liberal institution in terms of... Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And so there is also here an enormous margin of maneuver in terms of analysis of thought, levels of how we look at this international and how we deal with it. Now, I just wanted to do a very last exercise, and then I give the floor to the audience. We have been talking about the obvious that's going on, either in the Sahel, either in the Ukraine, of course, and also other examples. Yemen, you spoke about Yemen, you spoke about the Syrian civil, big/horrendous war. And what if, I think there's still an area within the world that we haven't talked about at all, which has so much potential for trouble, conflicts, and big issues, particularly because of issues pertaining nuclear proliferation, which is, call it the Indo-Pacific, call it the Asia-Pacific, call it the other side of the world, it doesn't matter, but it's there. And it's, to a certain extent, pretty much far away. Now, as I think that's also something for us to think about when we know of North Korea, when we know of everything that's going on within this other region of the world, which is really far away, but at the same time, it is definitely not. And secondly, trying to go back to the question, this issue of the fashionable wars, which of course is a huge provocation. No war should be fashionable, but it's really within this element of the media attention it gets, the social media attention that it gets, and how all of us, independently of how interested we are, we have short attention spans, which was a point that you made, which I think is really good to make. In the beginning, we are all horrified, then we start to normalize the horror, and that's it. We just get used to it. And I think that's, for instance, something that we can learn from even the ancient Greeks like Thucydides. When he describes the Peloponnesian War, it's just something that comes out immediately in this idea that in the beginning, everybody is really worried about the moral dilemmas of war. And as the war goes on and on and on, it just dehumanizes everything and everybody. So in taking that into account, what can we do individually in order to not just call out these issues to the attention of everybody? What can we do in our daily lives in order to avoid fashionable wars or fashionable conflicts? Saved by the bell. Oh, sorry, I thought we ended at 4:30. Oh, forgive me. So, food for thought. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be in this room, in this conference. It's my first time in this conference. I am so amazed and I'm so proud to be in this such a gathering where global challenge is being discussed. My food of thought goes straight to Mr. Bakary. I heard you attentively related to our continent that we both share, despite the fact that I'm not living there now for 2 years. Maybe you just flew from Senegal. But I have heard the same rhetoric. Again, we blame our former colonies for our problems. You highlighted very nicely that the new generation should have different perspective on how to see Africa. But are we Africans doing enough to be seen as we like to be seen? This is a very good question. I think we must question ourselves before asking people to treat us in a very feasible way. We should do enough to be treated in that way. Regarding the African Union, I highly remember Thomas Sankara, who said, "Who feeds you controls you." How can we think that African Union can be an actor when 70% of African Union budget is sponsored by foreign players? For instance, European Union itself. Who feeds you controls you. This is a very brutal reality that goes there into Africa. So it sees that how African wars being treated into those who found Africans for themselves. So we cannot question more as we are not doing enough to be treated in that way. Firstly, I think we should all be into this old world, like we should release Africa from those who hijack Africa. Africa is not hijacked by foreign powers, though there is still some responsibilities that the international community holds in its place. But Africans themselves are hijacking their continent into debt corruption, poverty, not doing basic thing for their own population. This is a thing that we should solve first. So I'm asking Mr. Bakary now, how could you think, what is your perspective? I'm thinking that the G5 Sahel, for instance, now Mali is not anymore a member of G5 Sahel.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you really need to.
I'm doing
shorten.
my question now.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. How do you think that France can play a main role in G5 Sahel to stabilize the sub-Saharan Africa while we are welcoming the Russians in our own soil? For instance, we are welcoming another player who is not in France, but we are just, as you said, we are just changing from one master to another master. What do you think that African countries should do, for instance, G5, sub-Saharan Africa? Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for both questions. I have one more question here in the front, and then I think we just collect one more, and I give it to my wonderful speakers today.
Bom, eu gostava de dizer duas ou três coisas que provavelmente serão tidas como heresias, blasfémias, qualquer coisa dessa.
Eu peço é que seja breve, está bem?
Está bem. Ora, eu não queria... A nossa Constituição aponta para a cooperação e não para a guerra. E aí é que tem que ser a matriz da nossa intervenção. O Presidente da República falou há pouco da guerra global que se trava na Ucrânia. A guerra global na Ucrânia não é entre a Rússia e a Ucrânia, é entre a Rússia e o chamado mundo ocidental. Portanto, 30 países contra a Rússia. E a invasão não é invasão nenhuma. A invasão começou... A entrada pela União Soviética, não é? Paulatinamente, sem disparar um tiro, entrou-se lá com o Yeltsin e depois com aquela gente, com os guardas que estavam a guardar a fortaleza, que entregaram a fortaleza. Aí foi que começou.
E qual é que é a sua pergunta?
Isto é uma reflexão...
Desculpe, mas eu tenho imensos oradores.
E que a Raquel Vaz Pinto não gosta deste
Não, a
tipo
Raquel
de
Vaz Pinto está a moderar um painel. Portanto,
Pois.
ou faz a sua pergunta ou eu vou passar aqui para a frente.
Já vi que me está a interromper, está a terminar.
Muito obrigada.
Obrigado.
Yes, it's coming.
I think the key question is, you have raised this, Raquel. Wars are fought over geographical space, defined by borders, which were, in the case of Africa and many parts of Asia and less Latin America, done by colonies, imperial powers, with no regard to emotional space. And the international relations theory does not take into consideration emotional space except in the Monroe Doctrine, which I find very strange. Can you please answer that?
Monroe Doctrine. Good. I am so glad I am not answering these questions. Can you take them now, or should I round up some more? One more question? Yes, please. No, there is a there. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to thank everyone that's here. My question is for Mr. Bakary Sambe. You are right to say that the European Union needs to help the African Union to be successful, not just because of the colonial past of the European powers, but also because the African continent has a huge potential to grow in economical and social terms. So if the African Union, if the European Union needs to help the African Union, why is OPEC crippling the EU's and the developed world's economic power by cutting oil production and probably causing a massive world recession? Thank you.
I think that now we go to our speakers. Is that okay, Bakary? Do you want to start, or who wants to start?
I can start.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, my brother from Africa. You know, I'm not exonerating Africa, and I'm not into victimization. I'm part of the generation that considers that Africa must take its destiny into its own hands. It's what I say in the beginning. I'm part of those who had the courage to stay on the continent to fight corruption, to address this problem, to fight bad governance. But what I say is, I'm not so European Union or the European. I know the responsibility we have as a new generation to address this problem with our indigenous strategy and solution to combat corruption. Even, I can say more. I have an office in Bamako with the Timbuktu Institute African Center for Peace Studies. But I'm one of the people who are criticizing the military coup. I quietly not shut my office, but I don't want anymore to work with a government from a coup, because I believe in democracy, I believe in freedom. I'm not, for example, and in Africa, the problem we have now is like some people who are saying that we want to be free from France, but to be now the slaves or dominated by the Russia. I'm not in this perspective. I think that the solution for Africa will come from the Africans. I agree totally with you. When African Union, even the building was built by China, you know, and the headquarters, and the salary of the people of the African Union people were paid by the European Union. I think it is a shame regarding the resources, regarding what we have there. But I think that we are in co-responsibility. We cannot also exonerate our Western partners, like the World Bank, like IMF, when they impose this structural adjustment to our countries. And I think that now I'm not just claiming or saying that, okay, we are victim. No, I want that this new generation, including you, I hope you will come back to Africa, but we need you there also. The struggle is there, you know, so perhaps from here. And to tackle all this problem, taking our responsibility, but we cannot deny a new dynamic in the continent with very creative young people who are innovating, who are thinking about solutions and trying to push Africa to move forward. Thank you. And there is another question here, but I do not really understand what you want. It is about the relationship between African Union and European Union, or
it was on OPEP as well when it cuts to oil.
Oil. Okay, yeah. You know, I met one American guy who said, "Okay, guy, you know, your continent is being very interesting now." Okay, I say, oh, yeah, okay, thank you. I mean, to be yourself interesting is just to be in Africa, because now, but I'm very tired of this vision that Africa can be a variable of adjustment variable, or an alternative, because our partners do not speak to Africa like before the war in Ukraine and after, because now of oil and gas. And I think that we also have to avoid this position to be an alternative. We are not the alternative for the others. We can be, we have our own agenda, and we have to work according to our agenda. Otherwise, we'll fail in the same mistake during the last decade, and the situation will never change. Thank you.
May I suggest that you, because you are a speaker, you answer Andrew's question about the emotional space.
Chris has already asked me to answer that question. Teresa?
Oh, no, sorry. Yes. I don't agree with your premise. I think there's a lot of studies in international relations that go beyond the more sort of realist analysis of wars are fought over territory and resources. I think if you have a constructivist view of international relations, you open up space to things like emotions. But more than that, there are several theories that I find quite interesting in how to think about. I mean, there's a whole strand of politics of emotions, critical geopolitics, popular geopolitics, authors like Marcus, Sharp, Dolby, Tuathale, they all talk about how in order to mobilize a society to war, to be able to fight war, to feel a war as being legitimate, necessary, inevitable, there's a whole sort of work in terms of politics of emotions that needs to be there. It's also quite useful in terms of internal, so more domestic politics, so why are governments of far right being elected, you know, unfortunately a bit all over the place, and that has to do as well with the sort of instrumentalization of emotions towards the foreigner, the border, etc., that I think helps to explain certain dispositions towards that. So I don't think we lack theory. I think it's still not mainstream. Mainstream is still sort of realpolitik, and I would say that now it has sort of seen a very big comeback, yes, with, you know, Henry Kissinger, that Peace Prize Nobel, having a saying about what we think about Ukraine, etc. So I think there is a big comeback of realist assumptions, but realism, IR theory is most definitely not exhausted by realism. That would be incredibly poor, I would say. And I think most critical perspectives on IR do talk about emotions and how they play a role, how you can securitize the whole theory of securitization, for instance, Wever and Buzan, how you can actually very, you know, you can build a society towards being more amenable to war. I think, for instance, the US as a society has naturalized, normalized war. We're talking about a foreign power that has been at war for decades without stop. And so it normalizes the fact that the US is at war much more than other countries. Israel would be an example of that as well. And I don't think you can understand this without understanding emotions, fear, for instance, anxiety, ontological insecurity, all of that help explain why people are can be more easily convinced to accept wars and to fight wars. So I think there's that strand of the literature, I think, exists, and it's quite interesting. Yeah.
Hello? Yeah, I'm going to be short. I worked in the CL for 4 years between 2000 and 2004. And one ambassador from Canada was kidnapped and lived with Al-Qaeda groups for a couple of years. And I was on his debrief when he came out of that. At that time, Al-Qaeda groups in the Sahel were about 1,500 people in 30 groups. He described, and he was passed over many of these groups, so he lived with them. He came with more or less 40 kilos than he has before. Canada paid for his release to this Al-Qaeda. But he described that in the small village, they were received as heroes. And all the village he was passed by, they were given food, they will receive heroes, because they were related with the people at that time. Today in Africa, we have 70 countries with ISIS or Al-Qaeda groups. It's about half of the population. The countries where these groups operate are half of the population of Africa. And has gone out, the dimension is totally different. What needs to be done? Because I think this is a real danger fundamentalism grows on poverty, goes on being close to some of the aspirations of people. What can be done? The question is for Bakary. I don't think it's only resources, because this is organized. I'm Mozambican. I know how it developed in Mozambique very much, in detail. There's more civilian deaths in Mozambique than in Ucrania, by the way, only on this war, in the last 3 years. And the total support from the European Union to Mozambique for that was quite generous, was 134 million make available, not spent, for training.
Thank you. I think it's a
so
good
but the question is, how can we handle this? Because this is going to be a massive problem, not of Africa, of the world, in the next 20 years.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it's a very good question. More? Not more. But first of all, I would just like to. I'll give you the floor. Just before, I'm sorry. I really thought that the panel was ending at 4:30, so I apologize for taking too long. But I think that this last question deserves a good answer here by.
I would like also to add.
Yes. Okay.
I think that the mistake was to focus on war on terrorism without preventing violent extremism. So we did not address the root causes. We sent some planes, some weapons, some drones, but the root causes are still there: poverty, marginalization, and this is the problem. And even the objective of France in northern Mali, it was to make the terrorist group to disappear. They multiply. That's why I think that you have a double action and fighting, managing the security emergencies, but tackling the root causes of violent extremism, which is marginalization, which is frustration. Frustration in two levels, in national level and international level. When you let some countries do what they want and you punish the other one, there is no consistency of the way of the international community to deal with all these issues. And I think that I can give the last. I met a sheikh, a very prominent Muslim scholar in Mauritania. I said to him, what is the cause of all what is happening now in Sahel? I can reply to you in one sentence. Okay, it's good. He say in Arabic, سبب كل ذلك غطرسة الظالمين وجهل المظلومين. That means the cause of what you are seeing in the world now, and mostly in Africa, is the combination between the arrogance of unjust and the ignorance of those persons consider themselves as the victims. So there is a part of arrogance of the unjust internationally and nationally, and the ignorance of those populations. And I trust on education. I think that education must be the weapon of mass construction of citizenship and solidarity. Thank you.
If I may, so I really appreciated your question, Raquel, when you mentioned about what you can do, because we are talking about wars, but how we can act at the various level, individual level, about that. So I would say that wars touches everyone. You know, we usually think in terms of proximity, geographical proximity. We think far away from the battlefield, that will, you know, we are not really concerned. But I strongly believe that everyone at its personal level can act in order to work towards peace. What you should understand that the state of peace is not a natural state of affairs. And I would say something so simple that it might appear a little stupid. But when you make war, peace, you will never fall into your lap from the sky, or thanks to an intervention from God, for example. We will not have peace if you're not working for it. And that will be my message, in fact. So that it's precisely in times of wars that we should think about this, what is the next step. The diplomatic negotiation never should stop. And when I think about that, I will give just an example. Altiero Spinelli, who was on a little island in a fascist jail in June 1941, the worst moment in European history, in 1941, at the beginning of World War II. And he wrote that time, he wrote a manifesto for peace and for united Europe, which will become 40 years later a project for the Treaty of Maastricht and the Treaty of Lisbon. So they will continue the Treaty of Lisbon. So I can say we are not in jail now. We are not in jail, so we can express ourselves. We can work, but that is really my message, because that it's not peace. It's not a natural thing. Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, said peace has to be established. Peace has to be instituted. And of course, everyone can act at each one level. So that is the message I wanted to leave.
I think this is the perfect line to end this panel and thank our speakers.